Welcome to Free Science Fiction Stories. Today's story is Silent Currents, Deadly Threats, where an isolated research facility clings to survival in a hostile, post-apocalyptic world.
Silent Currents, Deadly Threats. The Ocean 9 research, arcology crouched on the seabed, its geodesic domes faintly glowing like lanterns against the abyssal dark. Once a proving ground for sustainable life support needed deep space colonization, the facility now stood forgotten, left to decay as the world above descended into chaos. The Earth's dying whispers never reached these depths. Here life clung to the edges, tenuous and fraying. It had been years since they had any contact with the surface. When the last supply ship had come, most of the staff had left with it. The war had taken so much. Not just the station's funding, but the purpose and the mission of those who chose to remain aboard. Within the main control hub, Elena stared at the sonar display, its soft blue light reflecting off her face. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 2 days, not since the systems began their latest cycle of glitches. The screen flickered erratically, showing ghostly shapes that came and went on the periphery of the eastern array. She leaned in closer, frowning. The readings weren't right. The waveforms pulsed irregularly, too organic to be sediment displacement, yet too diffuse to be a school of fish. She tapped a command, recalibrating the sonar, but the interference remained. "This isn't right," she muttered to herself. "Are you sure it's not sediment or something?" Adrian's voice cut across the room. The station's engineer sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by tools and parts he'd scavenged from an old drone. His wiry frame hunched over the machinery as he worked, sweat beading on his forehead. The drone's outer casing lay open, its circuits exposed like the organs of a dissected corpse. "The eastern array's picking up something," Elena said, her tone clipped. "Ghost echoes. Moving but faint." Adrian shrugged, wiping grease from his fingers. "Probably sediment again. We're overdue for a proper cleaning cycle." "It's not sediment," Elena insisted, her eyes narrowing at the screen. "It's different." "Different how?" came a new voice. Samir entered the room, his lab coat wrinkled and streaked with damp stains. He carried a datapad, its screen displaying water sample analysis. As the station's biologist, Samir spent most of his time monitoring Ocean 9's ecosystems. What little was left of them, Elena gestured to the display. "The patterns don't match sediment or fish. Look at this." She tapped the screen, and the waveform expanded. It jittered, irregular, almost like a heartbeat in distress. Samir frowned, his curiosity piqued. He stepped closer to study the data. "Could be interference. Algae buildup?" Adrian scoffed. "Algae wouldn't move like that. If anything, it's probably just turbulence from—" "No," Elena insisted, silencing them both. She leaned back in her chair, her frustration evident. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Just run a diagnostic on the array, Adrian. Make sure it's clean." Adrian grumbled but rose to his feet, grabbing his toolkit. "Fine. I'll take the drone and—" "No," Elena interrupted sharply. "Don't risk the drone. We don't have parts to repair it if something happens." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "So what? You want me to go out there myself?" "Just stay in range. And be careful." Farther into the station, Mara knelt beside a hydroponic tank, her hands expertly inspecting the roots of a tomato plant. The tank's water gurgled softly, its surface rippling under the glow of overhead lights. Despite the station's decay, the hydroponic systems remained functional, yielding small but reliable harvests. Mara's care had kept them running long past their expected lifespan. But something was wrong. The tank beside her, usually brimming with darting fish, was eerily still. She frowned, peering closer. Not a single fish remained. The water was pristine, untouched by decay, yet empty. "Samir!" Mara's voice crackled through the comm system. She tapped her headset, her tone wavering with unease. Did you move the fish for testing? The biologist's reply came after a moment's pause. No. Why? They're gone, Mara said, her stomach tightening. Not dead, just gone. That doesn't make sense, Samir replied. Are you sure? I'm looking right at it, she snapped. The tank's empty. Mara's gaze darted around the room, searching for any clue. The water surface was calm, undisturbed. There were no signs of predation, no floating debris. It was as if the fish had vanished into thin air. In the eastern sector, Adrian traversed a narrow access corridor. His headlamp cast long shadows on the walls, illuminating rusted pipes and corroded panels. The air felt colder here, heavier, as though the darkness pressed in with intent. He adjusted some controls, watching the camera feed. The corridor ahead opened into an abandoned storage bay, its ceiling partially collapsed. Stagnant water pooled on the floor, reflecting the drone's light in fractured patterns. The walls bore deep scars, like something had clawed at the metal. He paused, frowning. Elena, you seeing this? He asked through the comm. What is it? Her voice replied, tense. Scratches, big ones. Can you get a closer look? Adrian moved forward, boots crunching over debris. The scratches were jagged, raking across the metal like a predator's marks. He knelt beside Downed, his breath fogging in the chill. Something wasn't right. The camera flickered, static crackling across the feed. Adrian? Elena's voice came again, sharper now. What's happening? He opened his mouth to reply, but a sound cut him off. A low, resonant vibration, almost like a hum. It came from deeper within the storage bay, reverberating through the metal walls. Adrian froze, his heart pounding. Then, in the corner of his vision, something moved. A blur darted across the camera feed, too fast to make out. Adrian spun around, his flashlight sweeping the corridor, but it was empty. The hum grew louder, closer, resonating in his chest. Elena, he whispered, backing away. There's something here. Get out of there, Elena barked. Adrian sprinted back down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the dark. The hum followed him, a spectral sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the main hub, slamming the bulkhead door shut behind him. Later, the crew gathered in the mess hall, their faces drawn and pale. Adrian recounted his experience, his voice trembling with residual fear. Something's out there, he said, glaring at Elena. Samir rubbed his temples. You're sure it wasn't just a shadow, a trick of the light? I know what I saw, Adrian snapped, and those scratches weren't from corrosion. Something's moving in the abandoned sectors. Mara leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. My fish tank didn't just empty itself. Whatever's happening, it's not natural. The room fell silent. The hum of the station's life support systems filled the void, a constant reminder of their isolation. Elena's gaze drifted to the ceiling, where a faint vibration trembled through the walls. She clenched her fists. We need more information, she said finally, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. We investigate further. But no one goes alone. The next time something happens, take Decker with you. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. In the oppressive silence, the station seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Outside, the abyss pressed closer, its shadowed depths hiding something patient. In the distance, faint and haunting, a low whistle carried through the water. The station creaked under the weight of its own solitude. A steel leviathan sunk into the abyss. The station's automated air pumps, filtration, geothermal taps had always been a reassuring rhythm, a heartbeat of continuity amidst the crushing depths. But now that rhythm faltered. Small sounds, the tick of cooling metal, the hiss of displaced water, suddenly felt alien, unwelcome intrusions in what should have been the controlled stillness of their sanctuary. Elena hunched over her observation console in the biology lab. A grimace tugged at her lips as she cycled through the station's external feeds. The deep-sea cameras were supposed to provide a constant watch on the environment outside, illuminating the ocean floor with dim green light. But the signal was bad. She leaned closer, adjusting the feed. The usual bustle of deep-sea life, small darting fish and the odd tentacled silhouette was absent. A barren silence stretched beyond the station's lights. "Where are they?" she muttered, drumming her fingers against the console. The door hissed open, and Adrian ducked inside. He was covered in grease and seawater, the faint smell of burnt electronics clinging to his jumpsuit. "What now?" he asked gruffly. Elena waved him over. "Take a look at this. The fish outside are gone. Not just the ones near the station. Everything beyond the lights. No movement at all." Adrian frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Maybe the lights spooked them." She shook her head. "They've never reacted like this before." Adrian grunted, but unease flickered in his eyes. Elena didn't respond. She kept her gaze locked on the empty feed, her unease deepening. "And there's this reading here," she said, rolling her chair over to the sonar station. Her frown deepened as she inspected anomalous blips on the display. They moved erratically, too large to be debris and too slow to be marine life. "Every sensor can't be going out at once," she mused. The warning came too late. A sudden power fluctuation rippled through the station, causing lights to flicker and machinery to stutter. In the western sector, an external airlock hissed open, the sound reverberating through the empty corridors. Automated systems struggled to compensate, detecting an intrusion but failing to lock down the breach. Elena turned and said, "Adrian, get Decker and go to the West Wing now. We've got a breach. It's got to be handled manually." With a curt nod, Adrian grabbed a large set of tools and ran out the door. Decker, a towering figure in black tactical gear, drew his weapon and motioned for Adrian to follow. "Stay close," he ordered, as they descended into the abandoned research wing. The air grew colder as they entered the dimly lit space. Massive tanks of dark water loomed on either side of the corridor, their glass surfaces streaked with condensation and algae. Once used for testing deep-sea life forms, the tanks now stood as silent sentinels, their contents long since left to nature. Decker swept his flashlight across the room, the beam cutting through the haze. "Eyes open," he muttered, his voice low. "Something's not right." Adrian clutched his scanner, his fingers trembling as he glanced at the readings. "There's something here," he whispered. "Something big." A faint whistling sound echoed through the room, barely audible but unmistakably deliberate. Decker froze, his grip tightening on his weapon. The sound grew louder, a haunting melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Whistling like wind across the top of a bottle. "Up there," Adrian gasped, pointing toward the ceiling. A figure clung to the steel beams above. Its elongated limbs coiled like a predator preparing to strike. Its shell was dark and glossy, and it dripped water, as if it had just come from the ocean outside. 3 clawed arms gripped the beams with unnatural strength, while its pyramid-like head tilted toward them, rows of small black eyes glinting in the dim light. Decker fired, the gun's roar shattering the silence. The bullets struck the creature's carapace, but it barely flinched, its movements unhurried. It vanished into the shadows, reappearing moments later, closer. "Move!" Decker shouted, grabbing Adrian's arm and pulling her toward the exit. The creature lunged, its claws slicing through the air inches from Adrian's face. Decker fired again, aiming for its legs, but the creature twisted mid-air, its movements disturbingly fluid. It landed with a splash, its whistling call echoing like a siren. Adrian stumbled, dropping his scanner as the creature advanced. Decker shoved him behind, unloading the remainder of his magazine. The bullets ricocheted off the creature, sparking against the steel walls. "Go! I'll cover you!" he shouted. They fled through the maze of tanks, the creature pursuing them with bursts of unnatural speed. It moved in and out of the shadows. Decker sealed a bulkhead behind them, his chest heaving as he braced against the door. Adrian collapsed beside him, his breath ragged. What was that?" he stammered. Decker didn't answer. He stared at the door, the faint sound of whistling seeping through the metal, a grim reminder that whatever had breached their sanctuary wasn't finished with them yet. "We've got to figure out a way to stop that thing," Decker said, his brow furrowed with determination. "Let's go get the others." The station's emergency lights pulsed in rhythmic bursts, casting harsh, intermittent shadows along the flooded corridors. Water sloshed at knee-height, dark and slick, reflecting the dying flicker of failing fluorescence. Elena led the survivors through the labyrinthine lower sectors of Ocean 9, her breath ragged in the cold, damp air. Behind her clutched a makeshift spear, his face pale but resolute. Mara brought up the rear, her flashlight trembling as she scanned the water for movement. It had to be close. They heard it before they saw it, the scrape of clawed limbs against the steel walls, the wet thud of something large moving through the station. Its pyramid-like head glided unnaturally around the corner, inspecting them. "Faster!" Elena hissed, her voice sharp with fear. Adrian paused to close an emergency flood door. The ancient mechanism groaned as the rusted gears struggled to comply. "This'll slow it down," he muttered. His arm twitched a little, and he moved it. "It won't stop it," Mara whispered, her wide eyes fixed on the corridor behind them. "Nothing does." A guttural clicking noise echoed through the station, followed by a high-pitched whistle that sent a shiver down their spines. Elena grabbed Adrian by the arm and dragged him forward as the doors slammed shut behind them. The brief reprieve from the creature's pursuit only deepened the dread. They all knew it was still hunting them, stalking through the maze of corridors like a predator playing with its prey. The lower sectors were a graveyard of forgotten technology, half-submerged computer consoles and walls dripping with condensation. The air was heavy with the stench of salt and decay. Elena motioned for silence, pressing a finger to her lips. The others froze, their breaths shallow as they strained to listen. Somewhere in the distance, water rippled. The sound of something large sliding beneath the surface sent a jolt of panic through the group. Mara spotted a narrow maintenance crawl space partially hidden by debris. "In there!" she whispered urgently. Adrian hesitated. "It's barely big enough." "Just go," Elena snapped, shoving him toward the opening. One by one, they crawled into the cramped space, the water rising to their chests. Mara switched off her flashlight, plunging them into near-total darkness. The only sound was their labored breathing and the steady drip of water from above. The monster's shadow loomed outside, its three elongated arms trailing across the walls as it searched. It paused, tilting its head as if listening. The faint bioluminescence of its blood reflected off the water, casting eerie patterns across the walls of the crawl space. It had been wounded by the gunshots earlier, but the damage hardly seemed to faze it. Mara held her breath as the creature's claws scraped against the entrance. It leaned closer, the jagged edges of its head nearly brushing the opening. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the monster could hear it. But just as suddenly as it had stopped, the creature straightened and moved on, its whistling fading into the distance. Adrian exhaled shakily. "Let's go to the research dome," he said. The survivors emerged into the lower research dome, a vast chamber once dedicated to studying deep-sea ecosystems. The dome's glass walls groaned under the immense pressure of the ocean, spider-web cracks spreading ominously across the surface. Outside, the abyssal dark pressed against the fragile barrier, the weight of the deep threatening to crush them all. Elena glanced at the control panel, its screen flickering erratically. "This dome can't take much more. We flood it. Use the pressure to finish it off. The sudden pressure change of the collapsing dome should be enough," Adrian said. "But that will destroy our last ship dock," Mara said in a hushed tone. "No one was ever coming to get us, Mara," Elena said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "We made that decision a long time ago. If that thing came from the surface, there was never anything worth going back for." Mara hesitated, her gaze darting between the dome and the corridor behind them. "What if it doesn't work? What if we all—" It'll work, Elena interrupted, her voice steely. They scrambled to set the trap. Decker placed a remote charge on the interior of the dome. Mara positioned herself near the dome's entrance, ready to lure the creature inside. Elena worked furiously to clear debris, her hands trembling as the monster's whistling tones grew louder, closer. "It's coming," Mara whispered, her voice barely audible. The thing burst into the dome at a full run, its claws slicing through the air as it lunged for Mara. She dove out of the way, narrowly avoiding its grasp. The creature was leaking some glowing fluid now. The light from it intensified, casting the chamber in an otherworldly light. "Now!" Elena shouted. Decker ignited the charge. The sound was just a muted trump, but it was enough to start a chain reaction of cracks on the dome. The monster screeched, its movements becoming frantic as it realized the trap. It lashed out, smashing equipment and sending shards of glass flying. Mara cried out as a piece of debris grazed her arm, drawing blood. Elena grabbed a broken metal rod and swung it at the monster, buying everyone precious seconds to get to the exit. The creature turned on her, its pyramid head tilting as if in mockery. It lunged, but Decker tackled her out of the way, the two of them landing hard against the wall. The water level rose rapidly and the monster thrashed, its screeches reverberating through the dome. The cracks in the glass walls deepened, and Elena's heart sank as she realized they might not escape in time. "Go!" Decker yelled, shoving her toward the exit. "What about you?" Elena shouted back. He drew his pistol and fired at the alien thing. It was not time for subtlety, and he shot as fast as he could, reloading as he stepped back toward the exit. The creature's steps seemed uncertain, its previous speed hampered by the rising water. Decker was the last through the door, and Adrian slammed it behind him. With a tremendous crash, the dome imploded and the group ran to the far end of the corridor, determined to put as much distance as they could between them and the collapsing habitat. The survivors stumbled into the station's central hub, their bodies battered and their spirits broken. The once thriving Ocean 9 was now a tomb, its systems failing and its corridors flooding. Elena slumped against a wall. They sat in the darkness, the weight of their survival pressing down on them. In the distance, faint whistles echoed through the station, soft, haunting, and unrelenting. In time, they faded to nothing. The crew, now trapped in a world of silence and shadows, had made a terrible choice. They would remain hidden, isolated from the surface, hoping the darkness wouldn't find them again. Life and the station were theirs, for as long as they could keep it.
Enjoy this story? Subscribe to Free Science Fiction Stories for daily sci-fi adventures.